When we picture the wars of the ancient world, we typically imagine two massive empires clashing head-on. We visualize thick lines of infantry, heavy shields, and brutal, symmetrical combat fought over an open field. But the historical record tells a stranger story. Some of the most heavily armed superpowers of antiquity were humiliated by enemies who simply ignored conventional rules of engagement. We can see this play out across two vastly different landscapes: the deeply fortified, predictable kingdom of ancient Egypt and the wild, untamed expanse of the Eurasian steppes. In these distinct arenas, early military dominance evolved along two opposite paths. One culture focused on physical, technological innovation, while the other relied on a psychological doctrine of mobility and deception. Looking at these diverging strategies shows us that raw size and heavy armor were inherently vulnerable to innovation. A massive army was only useful if the enemy agreed to stand still and fight. For over 1,500 years, ancient Egypt operated as an isolated, untouchable fortress. Protected by vast surrounding deserts and sustained by the predictable rhythms of the Nile, the Egyptian state built a culture of absolute security. This satellite view of the Nile Delta shows exactly why the northern coastline, with its connectivity to the eastern land bridge, became a massive trade magnet. Over decades, commerce brought a steady stream of Asiatic merchants settling in a northern hub called Avaris. It was a slow-motion migration, driven by cargo, not an invading army. Over time, these immigrant families grew so wealthy that they amassed actual regional power. While the native Egyptian central government was distracted by internal issues down south, these merchants usurped control of the north, ruling as the shadow pharaohs, the Hyksos. The tension finally boiled over because of an absurd diplomatic insult. The Hyksos king Apepi sent a letter to the native Egyptian king in Thebes, hundreds of miles away, claiming that the Theban hippopotamus pools were too loud and keeping him awake at night. Outraged by the deliberate mocking of his autonomy, the Theban king Seqenenre-Tao gathered his forces and marched north to fight. The campaign was a disaster. Tao's own mummy reveals he was killed in combat, and his forces suffered a crushing defeat. The death of a pharaoh at the hands of foreign rulers ruling inside the country proved a harsh reality. Static geographic barriers had failed to protect the Egyptian throne. The native Egyptians were facing an enemy with a massive technological advantage, while using tools that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The Hyksos had introduced transformative upgrades to the region. They utilized the horse-drawn war chariot, allowing for rapid battlefield mobility, and they fought with advanced bronze weaponry, bringing lethal, refined metalwork that shattered standard Egyptian defenses. To survive, the Egyptians had to adopt the exact technology that defeated them. Years later, Ahmose I weaponized these new chariots and bronze blades to lay siege to Avaris, eventually chasing the occupying Hyksos forces out of the region and up into Syria. The trauma of the occupation forced Egypt to abandon its centuries-old isolationism. They established a professional standing army and built an aggressive, heavily mechanized empire to ensure no foreign power could ever walk through their front door again. While Egypt centralized its power behind thick stone walls, a different kind of warfare was taking shape out on the steppes of Eurasia. This was a sprawling, unbroken landscape devoid of urban infrastructure or natural defensive choke points. This geography allowed the Scythians to weaponize their nomadic lifestyle. Because they lacked fixed borders or permanent farmlands, they remained impossible to pin down, moving as a decentralized force that offered no target for a traditional army to strike. This lack of a fixed target baffled massive traditional invasion forces. When the Persian king Darius marched into Scythian territory with a massive, well-supplied army, he expected to crush a rigid, hierarchical power in a decisive open battle. Instead, the Scythians refused to engage. Their doctrine relied on continuous, calculated retreat. They burned the sparse grasslands as they fell back, luring the slow-moving Persian army deep into a deadly, resource-barren wilderness until exhaustion set in. Alongside this strategic exhaustion, they deployed chilling psychological tactics. According to accounts from ancient historians, Scythian warriors engaged in terrifying rituals, utilizing the skulls of fallen enemies to break the morale of the invading forces. The Scythian strategy proved that even the best supplied infantry in the world becomes powerless the moment it faces an enemy that treats territorial retreat as a weapon rather than a defeat. Egypt and Scythia show wildly different responses to conflict. Egypt relied on intense centralization, adopting new technology, and projecting heavy, aggressive power outward. Conversely, the Scythian model thrived on decentralization, using strategic retreat to pull a rigid enemy inward until it collapsed. These are the opposite poles of early military genius. One is intensely physical and mechanized, while the other is elusive and psychological. They show us that ultimate dominance on the ancient battlefield rarely went to the side fielding the largest infantry line or possessing the steepest walls. By tearing up their old doctrines, adopting foreign technologies, or weaponizing the sheer emptiness of their terrain, these cultures survived. In antiquity, the victors were those willing to discard their old identities and rewrite the rules of engagement.